glad everybody could come and join me for a little chat. I've always been the sort of person who admires company and much enjoys the conversation that flows from it. We've got a lot of visitors who come to Mount Vernon, and I'm glad to talk with them all. The General and I are just returned from long years in the presidency. At last, I have him in his well-deserved retirement. 5 days after Mr. Adams took his oath of office last year in '97, I had the General and the coach bring him home. When I first married General Washington, he was young Colonel Washington, just retiring from long years out in the French and Indian Wars. And when he brought me first to Mount Vernon, I remember the sight so very well, almost 40 years ago. I was a young widow when we married, but 6 and 20 years we were when my neighbor introduced us. I readily could see that my little ones, my children were only 3 and 4 years then, they took to him. Most people don't know the General's very good with young children. They always quite readily called him dearest Papa. Still, it was not an easy undertaking after we were married to come all the way north of Williamsburg. I knew that he loved this place. His elder brother, Lawrence, had inherited it from his father. He had many happy memories of coming here when Lawrence was alive. So it was to Mount Vernon that he wanted to retire after long service to the country and western frontier. I well recall it was April of the year, a hot and dusty journey it was. It takes us almost a week to get from Williamsburg to Mount Vernon, and with 2 little children weeping and wailing about leaving the only home they'd ever known. It was not an easy undertaking. I think the General, again, he was then Colonel Washington, was very worried too, because the house then was quite small. And he kept making excuses to me, saying, now when I get home, I intend that I shall build both up and out. How was I to know then it would take him almost 40 years to achieve that plan? And I found later, after our arrival, some little notes that he'd sent on ahead with each passing day of our journey. One in particular was very touching. He was so worried about things being ready when I got here. The note said, light the fires, air out the rooms, rub the banister, get fresh eggs, she's coming. He said, we are so well placed that surely there is no home that has ever been, nor ever could be, that has ever sat on a finer situation. How well I remember when we first stood and looked out upon the river together. But the view is still the same one that he has loved all these years and had to leave so often for his country's sake. I knew at once when I stood there beside him that we had come home after all. One constant friend has been our dear physician and ancient old companion of the General's, Dr. Craik. He would inspire the soldiers by telling those stories of their early battles when they were both young men.
I'm George Washington's personal physician, also Physician General of the United States. And in the life of George Washington, I hold a very unique position, for he was my best friend. I met him during the French and Indian War. We were both serving with the Virginia Regiment. I was the surgeon for the regiment, and George was the Lieutenant Colonel commanding us at Fort Necessity. Now on the morning of the 3rd of July, about 9 or so in the morning, the enemy approached our trenches with dismal shouts and Indian yells. And they took to constantly firing from every little rise and stone, stump, bush, tree, rock, until the afternoon, when the heavens opened up with the most tremendous rain that could ever be conceived. Our trenches were flooded, our cartridge box and firelocks wet and useless. The enemy offered us the chance to surrender. No firepower, provisions ruined, and 1/3 of our men either dead or wounded. So, on the 4th of July, 1754, Lieutenant Colonel George Washington surrendered, and George and the other men were allowed to leave. Now I know what you're thinking. Why in the world would they let George Washington just leave? Well, I'll tell you why. That French officer commanding the enemy thought that George was such a poor commander that he would never make a leader of any merit. But that was just one man's opinion. A great many thought differently.
Dr. Craik made good use of that story during our war with the young soldiers fighting for our independency. To nurse the soldiers and to be there in camp was one of my great privileges indeed. The war, the sights and sounds that I shall never forget. To this day, though I enjoy all manner of music, when Nelly plays her spinet for us, I have always said that the sweetest sound is the sound of the fifes and drums. In camp, we would hear the sounds of the drums marking every hour of the day. Oh, those sounds that I associate still with my beloved soldiers. I, who had never known anything of war and battle, shuddered every time I heard the sound of cannon and shot. The inhabitants of Boston had gotten all too used to it by then.
Good day to you, and please allow me to introduce myself. I am William Lee, body servant to His Excellency General Washington. Now, I joined the General back in 1768, 1 year after the passing of my former master, Colonel John Lee. Now, you may ask yourself, what does a manservant do? Each morning I do rise with the sun. I then do dress the General's hair to a neat military queue with no sideburns, a ribbon on the actual queue. I do lay out his clothing. If there are stains, I remove them. Seams undone, I mend them. And I do famously accompany him on his travels. The war for freedom, all 8.5 years, all 13 battles. I'm sure you would like to hear one of our martial endeavors, yes? Very well. This happened on June 28, 1778. I was riding at the head of the Corps of Ballets, as was common. We halted by an extremely large sycamore tree, from whence could be seen an extensive portion of enemy lines. So there I unslung my telescope, cut behind my leather case, just there behind my saddle. I pulled it, applied it to my eye, and began to observe the enemy. But while I was observing the enemy, I could feel that someone was watching me. So I then quickly lowered my telescope. I looked about myself. There,